G'day, my name's Ebony Bennett. I'm the Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series. I can see our attendees streaming through the door, so to speak, climbing up over 150. It's looking good. So welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. The Canberra area is Ngunnawal country, and I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also extend a greeting to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders joining us on this webinar today. Today is the last day of the Australia Institute's the day after the Australia Institute's end of financial year appeal. And we thank everyone for their support as part of that end of financial year appeal. But if you do have the capability of chipping in a couple of dollars to help cover the costs of these webinars that we put on for free, we would really appreciate that. And you can donate at tai.org.au/donate. And just a few tips before we begin to help things run smoothly today. If you hover over the bottom of the screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of our panelists today. And you should also be able to upvote questions from other people and make comments. We will take questions as per usual in the second half of the webinar. And if you would like to ask yours live to the panel, there's a raise your hand function and a little hand emoji appears beside your name, and I can call on you in the second half. And lastly, just a reminder that this discussion is being recorded, and we always put up a copy of that recording available to everyone who's registered. We'll send that around to you afterwards and up on our website. So today we are talking about navigating the Australia-China relationship, which to this layperson at least, it doesn't really look to me like we're doing a bang up job of it at the moment. We've got trade disputes over Australian beef and barley, China making travel warnings about coming to Australia. Australia obviously kicked off a lot of this disruption with the call for an independent UN investigation into the origins of the pandemic. So the relationship between Australia and China has been quite rocky of late. And to talk to you about that today, we've got Professor Jane Golley. She's an economist and the director of the Australian Centre on China in the World at the ANU. And her research over several decades has covered a wide range of Chinese transition and development issues, including industrial agglomeration and regional policy. And I might just say I had to look up agglomeration. Hadn't come across that word before. Demographic change and economic growth, rural, urban and gender inequalities in education and income, and the Belt and Road Initiative, which we've all obviously heard of by now. And Jane's been actively engaged in public policy and media debate regarding the Australia-Chinese relationship for quite some time now. And she's also the co-editor of the China Story yearbook series, including Power, published in 2019, and China Dreams, that was published this year. And joining her in conversation today is Allan Behm, the head of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs Program. Welcome to you both, Jane and Allan.
Thank you, Ebony.
First to you, Jane. I did just kind of touch on this, but we evidently have a problem in our relationship with China at the moment. Kind of, what is the scope of that, and what is at the heart of that problem?
Thanks, Ebony, and thanks very much to the Australia Institute for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to first of all also acknowledge that I'm sitting on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respect to their elders past and present, and also to all those elders past and present on all of the lands that we're sitting on today. Thanks for joining us. Do we have a problem? I think we've got lots of different problems with the relationship at the moment, and I hope we'll have some time to also talk about the bright points. I'm looking constantly for silver linings, although it's increasingly difficult at the moment to do that. And I think one of the big issues with the problems is that every different person across the country actually sees different problems, where some of us see opportunity, others see crisis. But in a nutshell, I think the big issue is that whereas for the last 25 years, for the whole time that I've been engaged in understanding China, we viewed it as an opportunity, particularly for the economists. We were right at front and centre of the celebrating, I guess, the celebrations of kind of the trading links and the investment and the prosperity that we shared with China as they rose rapidly and dramatically from being a very, very poor country to being still just a developing country, but on the verge of becoming a high-income country. I think what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years is a real shift in how the Australian government, and I think many of the people as well, think about our national interests, for those of us who think about them. And so you might just simply think of national interest as a function of security and prosperity. And while China was rising, we focused entirely on the prosperity side of the story, or largely, but now the security elements have become increasingly prominent, and I would say have come to dominate the national debate, and particularly the debate here in Canberra. And there are lots of reasons why that might have happened, but essentially the weighting has shifted towards security, and I think it's shifted excessively. And even then, in terms of how we define security, we've focused primarily on borders and what the outside can do to damage us. And we've forgotten, I think, to think about broader concepts of security, in particular environmental security, as one of the ways that we could be thinking about the relationship. I can unpack that a bit more. Shall I keep going? I've got quite a bit to say in this initial opening, and then I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Allan. But I think if we start at the top with the political relationship, there's no doubt the deterioration has been rapid. I'd say since 2016, but particularly since late 2017, when Xi Jinping stood up and said that he was essentially going to rule China for life if he wanted to. He wrote that into the constitution, and that was a real wake-up call for everyone. And I think a lot of fear came with that, essentially a realisation that China wasn't going to become like us. People had been, I think, wishfully thinking or hoping that China would follow a trajectory that led eventually towards a liberal, market-based, modern democracy. If you've understood or watched anything about China, you should have known earlier that that wasn't going to happen, but there was this expectation and hope, and that got crushed in that year. I mean, from then on, the relationships deteriorated. 2020 just disastrous. We hear regularly about the diplomatic freeze, the deep freeze. I'm wondering if we're actually now in Antarctica. Now, there are lots of valid reasons for why that fear has risen. I think, the way China has journeyed under Xi Jinping is upsetting for me. I mean, there are lots of things that it's done that are really troubling. What's happening in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, closer to home for me, on academic freedoms and on the freedoms of people more broadly, that's been very worrying. And that has resulted in growing distrust from the Australian side, but that mistrust has also been really compounded by the narrative that's unfolded under Trump and the Trump administration. I mean, the US is increasingly and almost consistently talking about China as an evil and malign communist state. The communist term is there in every aspect of the way they now talk about it. And so there's a really complex element there too. I think I might stop there. There's so much more for me to say, but why don't I pass over to Allan, and then we can take up the conversation. I've got things to say about the economic relationship, about the public perceptions, and we'll just see how it goes.
Thanks, Jane. And Allan, I might just go to you on that same question. What's the nature of the problem here? What's at the heart of it for you?
Look, I agree with everything that Jane has just said. There are a whole lot of indicators that come from China which are worrying and that we do need to think about. But by the same token, we need to understand a lot more about what motivates China, what drives China, what its strategic mindset is, what its longer-term political mindset is. This is the sort of work that the China and the World Centre has been doing for a number of years now. That is getting behind the sort of rather opaque curtain that China keeps around itself and beginning to understand what it is that we're really dealing with. The fact of the matter is that China is a growing power, and whether we like it or not, we've got to deal with that. And you don't deal with it by creating fear and panic. you deal with that by being calm and measured and deliberate, working your knowledge base as best you possibly can, and maintaining as much engagement with China as we possibly can. And that's the bit that is really worrying me at the moment. I think both sides of the equator, Beijing and Canberra, are both given to rather too much hyperventilation at the moment. There's a lot of sort of shouting and rather sort of strident remarks coming from the Australian side. And equally, China is giving as good as it gets. None of that gets us anywhere. Maybe a few politicians feel the better for having blown off steam. But if you ask anybody in the Australian financial or commercial or trading sector what they think about the current situation, they will tell you that we've created an environment making it so much more difficult for business to do what it's good at, which is doing business, and for them to contribute to growing our economy, which will remain quite dependent on China, whether we like it or not. And I think that requires a lot more measure and discipline, certainly on our part, but also on the part of the government in Beijing.
So I guess moving into the next phase of this, obviously we've identified that we've got a problem on a range of fronts there, but from Australia's perspective, what does Australia want from its relationship with China? First to you, Jane.
Well, that's a pretty tough question, again, because we're not all one united front, and I also don't work for the government, so I can only ascertain, from where I sit what the government might want, and then I could possibly talk about what I think they should want. But in terms of what they want, I think, the biggest issue that's come out really in recent years are concerns about China's interference in our political and policy processes, and more recently about their capacity to coerce or punish us when we don't do what they like. And of course, the government would prefer it if that weren't happening. I think there's lots of layers underneath that we need to think about, how you might choose not to disappoint Beijing or to make them cross with the things that you do in order not to be punished. It is a bit of a two-way street there, which doesn't amount to kowtowing, as you might sometimes hear being said of anyone who says perhaps we should be a little bit nicer, but there is an issue in there that I think deserves some careful thought. But I think what our government wants more than anything is to preserve the economic relationship while still being able to talk a little bit tough on China when they're doing things that we don't like, and also prevent them from doing those things that make our lives more difficult. Above all else, they would like to see the diplomatic and political communications restored so that they could talk things over. But I want to be a little bit more provocative, actually, and suggest that the Australian government, and I think the Australian people more broadly, were far more comfortable when China was rising, and we were just benefiting from their economics, and we weren't having to experience what comes with rising wealth. And what comes with rising wealth is power. And power is essentially synonymous with influence. So influence is a natural consequence of that rising power, and they've reached a point where they can practice it. The American government, through their wealth and power, influence all sorts of things that happen across the world, and we're fine with that, but we're not comfortable with it in the Chinese context. And that partly comes back to the question, or the fact that they're different from us, and we struggle with that, although they're not as different, I think, as many people are led to believe. We're all human beings after all. But there is this sense that I get that we'd be really much more comfortable if China sat and agreed to sit under the United States in the global hierarchy. And the problem is that they're not going to do that.
Allan?
That is absolutely correct. It's only a couple of years ago that Prime Minister Abbott was asked by Angela Merkel, how does Australia regard China? And his response was as forthright as I think it was naive, and that is with fear and greed. And I think that Australian governments have wanted China to be something other than it actually is. They want China to expand economically, as Jane said, but not to grow the power and the influence that comes with economic strength. And I think that what the government in Australia wants is for a China which is simply going to go along with what we like to call the international rules-based order as it was set up in the immediate post-Second World War years, and simply accept all of that with the overall leadership of the United States. And that clearly is not what China, or Russia for that matter, wants to accept at all. I'm certain that what China is looking for is a measure of parity with the United States over the longer term, and to be able to exercise leadership and a measure of power dominance in what it would regard as being its sphere of influence, which is Asia. And that is the point that we have to understand, and then manage our own affairs in a way that China's rise to dominance does not actually undermine our own prosperity, our own security, and our own ability to carve our way through a pretty tricky world. And I don't think any Australian government can do that when its policies are based either on misconception or based, more worryingly, on confected fear.
Allan, can I just ask you, when you say misconception there, can you just unpack that a little bit for me? Because I'm not quite sure what you're referring to there.
Yes, I think that as Jane hinted at, our expectations of China are in some respects limited in that we think China is going to be in the future the way it was in the past. We sort of think back to the early opening up of China in the early 70s and imagine that it's that kind of China that we're going to see as this century unfolds. The volumes that Jane Centre has put out in the last couple of years indicate that that just isn't how it's going to be. So we've got this sort of way of looking back at a kind of China with which we thought we were comfortable, and we look forward to a kind of China that we think we're going to be uncomfortable with. It would be my contention that we can be just as comfortable with the China that's going to emerge if we are able to maintain a bilateral engagement with China and to ensure that China itself is properly engaged in the way in which the world decides that it's going to manage itself. And that's really what I'm trying to get at here. And hence my emphasis whenever I talk and write about this on the primacy of a very strong and engaged diplomacy as the way for Australia to go forward, rather than a kind of unhappy reliance on defence muscle to be able to manage our interests over the long term. We might come back to this point in a little while, I suspect.
Yeah, so the next question that I had, obviously we've focused a lot to begin with on some of the problems that we're having with the relationship, but Australia, has quite a relationship with China over the past few decades, and a lot of that is based on, shared goals or common objectives. So what are the current common goals and objectives that Australia and China share at the moment, whether that's in scientific areas or, simply growing your economy? What are the things that unite us, Jane?
Oh, thanks. Well, nice to turn to the positives so quickly, Ebony, even though there are still plenty more problems that we could go back to. And
yeah, we'll come back to some of them.
In terms of common goals, well, again, let's be reminded of how we got to the situation, say, in 2014, when then Prime Minister Tony Abbott described China as our true friend. And it was the economic story that and the prosperity story that we shared with them for 30, 40 years. And I'm not going to reel out numbers at you. I hope that everyone here, has a pretty broad sense of them. Our education sector, of course, there are problems that have followed on from that, but the tourist industry, the mining industry, with a side set of problems that we can also then relate back to China. But there are a whole bunch of sectors, and more broadly, the Australian economic growth story of the last 30 years has a hell of a lot to do with China. And so prosperity is the opening point on what we have in common. But we also have regional security in common. They don't want war in the region. They don't want instability. There might be a question that follows quickly from, about what they've done in the South China Seas, for example. But if you look at that from the Chinese perspective, they see that as preserving sea lanes so that they can continue to trade and invest with the rest of the world. The environment, it is one area where there is such a golden opportunity with China. And again, people might look at China, they see the large population, they see all of the pollution and think, what an awful job they've done. But this is a developing country that is industrialized rapidly, and that, as I've written and researched about for many years, along with many other people at the ANU and across the country, they've really done some remarkable things in reducing their reliance on coal, in boosting their renewable energy sector. There is so much opportunity that we could share in that links back to my notion, the broader notion of Australian security. It's where prosperity and security, environmental security, go hand in hand. I mean, I'd also like to look at the Pacific as another example. Infrastructure building, there is such a high demand for it across this region, and by developing infrastructure, both Australia and China stand to benefit. And it's a clear example of where we could cooperate, where instead at this point in time we're really choosing to compete. And unfortunately, I don't think that's a competition that Australia is going to win. And that harks back to my PhD thesis and my industrial agglomeration word, Ebony. Sorry for using a jargonistic term to describe my research, but it basically focused on notions of industry agglomerating, concentrating in certain provinces or parts of the country or parts of the world, the eastern coast of China, and then by engaging government in investing in infrastructure and reducing transport links, what we've seen is the spread of industry that facilitates. And that, to me, is a big part of the Belt and Road Initiative. I totally accept that there are bigger strategic kind of objectives that they have, but I saw it from the beginning as an economist would, and it made sense to me. You develop railways and roads and you create new markets that are then opened up to bring prosperity to both the Chinese people and those distant markets. And you see that in the Pacific. I think there's a really big set of questions around that. If we both, China and Australia, genuinely care about development in the Pacific and not building our own influence there, we would work together to create opportunities for, I'm going to use the word again, environmentally sustainable infrastructure development. That's what the Pacific Islanders want. And we could both deliver that to them much better by working together than by working apart. And then on my last point on that is about values. And we hear so often the discussion about how we have these Australian values. I do cringe a little when I hear that one of them is equality, because I mean, it's a value that I certainly have, and I hope many of the listeners have. We don't all feel that way, but I don't think it's a value that belongs to Australia. That is a global value that I would hope we'd all aspire to. Neither China nor Australia is kicking it out of the park on that front. There are things we could learn from each other. It's, a lifelong interest of mine in inequality and in thinking about the ways that the Chinese government has done it well and also done it badly. So many things that we could cooperate on if we can find our way back there or there. And we're doing it in some instances.
Allan, you and I have spoken about, for example, global warming as being one area where we have shared interests, but also our scientific links. What are some of those other things that would make up, a comprehensive strategic partnership?
Look, I think that we have a lot in common with China. And indeed, I think if we were to do a proper spreadsheet, we may well find that we've got more in common with China than we have that's dividing us at the moment. We're just fascinated by the division. In the work that we do here at the Australia Institute, particularly in our International and Security Affairs program, we've been refocusing on the fact that national security ultimately stems from the security of each individual that lives here, that human security is actually the starting point of national security. So if we look at the way in which we and China survey the world at the moment, we've at least got three very big things that we would like to work on. Climate change is absolutely one of them. And if we were to go back to 10 years now, when Prime Minister Gillard was talking along with her environment minister, or rather climate change minister of the day, Greg Combet, to their Chinese counterparts. We had half a dozen big programs running in China. They're not running now, but they should be, because we've still got these common interests. And apart from working together on an existential threat like climate change, we do also have the existential threat of nukes. And although China has not been at the forefront of doing much on that subject, we need to work with China in order to make sure that we can bring down the nuclear threshold and perhaps ultimately get rid of them. And a third area, of course, is the pandemic. We, I think, miscued fairly seriously in our opening gambit on the pandemic by seeking, in some respects, to name and blame China for what occurred back in December and January in Wuhan. It would have been much smarter of us to have said, look, China clearly wants to resolve this problem. We've had scientific links going back nearly 40 years now. I mean, these are the things that Professor Peter Doherty has been talking about also, a Nobel laureate, talking about what we've been doing in the biological sciences. So that working with China to get to the base of that problem, and particularly in how we might be able to develop a vaccine that will make the world safer for everybody, these are much bigger common interests than, I'm afraid, the sort of slanging match that we might have around who's getting more weapons system and who's sort of trying to dominate the world through a Belt and Road initiative. It just seems to me that it's too easy for us to miss the important things and to get distracted by the things that are worrying but not determinative.
Thanks, Allan. Before we get to questions from the audience, and there's a lot of good questions in there, particularly a couple on human rights in China, which I'll come to first. But before we get to those questions, I did want to touch on the Lowy poll and the finding that Australians' trust in China has fallen, although I think the same can be said for our trust in the United States. But we're talking about China today. So I just wanted to unpick, Jane, if you thought there, like, what strong trends are coming through there that we either need to address or be worried about?
So the Lowy polls are interesting every year. I think they're quite loaded in the questions that they ask. I think it's a wonderful poll, and it's a really useful gauge of how the public is perceiving a whole bunch of things out in the rest of the world. I have started to think more often recently about what drives public perception. If you have a government narrative and a United States government narrative that is increasingly negative, and then you also have a press that is predominantly a Murdoch press driving a very pro-US line and pointing out all of the bad things that China's doing, and there's plenty of that they can point out, leave the rest of it out, and not surprisingly, the public's trust in China falls. And the numbers are pretty striking. 23% of adult Australians trust China a great deal or somewhat to act responsibly in the world. Surprisingly, that's very close to the number of people who think that Trump's going to behave responsibly in the world. I mean, again, I don't know if those are the two same 30% of people and how they assess their trust, but if I have to pick between those two leaders at the moment, I would actually side with Xi Jinping in terms of acting responsibly in global affairs. Not in terms of how he's treating the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but in terms of responsibly addressing the global pandemic. Some hiccups at the beginning, but they've come in hard. They've got the economy started up better than anywhere else in the world, really, and they just haven't done quite as bad a job as is portrayed in the press. But the point is still that trust has fallen in both the superpowers, and I want to take those hand in hand and really start talking more about what they're both getting wrong, but also perhaps we could be thinking more about what they both could be getting right and the role that Australia could play in steering them in that direction. Now, I don't want to oversell our capacity as a great power. We're not. a middle power perhaps, and we like to think we punch above our weight here, well, now might be the time to start working on how we can do anything. And I am channeling Hugh White here in his famous China choice book, where, the key point was that we shouldn't have to choose, and that we should find a way to navigate in between those two superpowers, especially when both of their leaders are behaving badly. I think there's still some scope for that, and that's where I'd love to see Australian government policy head.
Allan, do you have any response on the Lowy Institute poll?
I was very interested in the Lowy Institute poll, and not surprised, by the way, at its findings. Looking into the data, though, you do see that people are a bit confused, that the data doesn't show a consistency in people's attitudes across the board. And I suspect that part of that confusion is driven by what they're hearing and what they're reading. When you hear strong statements coming not only from the government, but from people who profess themselves to be very close to the government, when you hear very strong statements coming from very prominent journalists, and particularly, I think, from the News Limited, then it's not a surprise, I guess, that people think that they don't trust China and that they're frightened of it. One of the tasks for government, of course, is not to create fear, but to manage it. And that's essentially what I think Jane's been arguing, and certainly what I argue, that a measured and careful and deliberate diplomacy is how you manage those things rather than fomenting them.
Thank you. We're going to go to, sorry, Jane, did you want to add something to that?
I would just like to follow up on that point of confusion. And there are a lot of very complex things happening in the world, and some of us spend our whole days and sometimes sleepless nights thinking about them. Everyone else comes in and gets glimpses from time to time and, has to make their assessment. And we should all be trying to do that. But, a couple of points that came out of the Lowy poll that were particularly interesting for me as an economist. One was that 9 in 10 Australians, 94%, want our government to reduce our economic dependence on China. And another 82% said that we should sanction Chinese officials associated with human rights abuses. Now, there's a lot of thinking that needs to go on underneath, and I hope we get a chance to talk about more the dependency issue or our interdependency. A lot of economists looking at, there are security analysts looking at it, there are important numbers behind that context. I can quickly flip around a dependency problem and talk about it as a benefit, and I have done that this year, looking at the growth projections for the globe and seeing that our dependency on China, likely to be the fastest growing economy of all our major trading partners this year. Still, the forecasts have dropped. They're down at 1%, but that's compared with minus 10% for Europe and the US, that actually our dependence could be a real positive. On sanctions, really complex literature on whether they work, on what they're trying to achieve, on whether there would be alternative ways to achieve change in Chinese government policy. I mean, that's what a sanction is. It's a coercive measure. It's a form of influence in someone else's domestic territory, exactly what we don't want them to be doing. And also one that I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect is very unlikely to work. And not only will it not work, but it will come at a cost to us. And you can speak to the barley farmers to understand what kind of cost that might be. It'll be in terms of jobs and growth. So a bit of a long-winded response, but just to say these are really difficult questions to ask the public to give a response to. The fact that 94% of them could have one answer suggests that they're being directed in a way that doesn't resonate well with my 25 years of understanding and thinking as an economist focused on China.
So that does take me, I guess, to this. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A that are touching on human rights abuses in China, particularly surrounding the Uyghurs. But I just want to take this question from Oksana, who asks, as an international lawyer, immediate concerns regarding China's human rights infringements through both internal policies and external objectives make Australia's economic objectives difficult to reconcile. And their question is, which interests prevail, humanitarian or economic? And just recognising that we're more from the economic side of things than we are from the human rights side of things, perhaps on this panel, I do think it's a question that comes up perennially. And I feel like certainly in the past, you know, there was much less interest in some of the human rights abuses in China because things were going so well economically, whereas now they seem to be getting more attention, not only in Australia, but globally, perhaps. Allan, I might come to you first.
Okay. Look, that is a very important question, but I would start in commenting on the question by saying that the binary that is put there, that is human rights or the economy, is only one way of talking about it. And I don't think that it's a way of talking about it that helps you get an answer. Because in a curious way, you can only solve each part of that binary by relying on tools that exist in the other part of the binary. And to that extent, I would say that the issue is very much more complicated than simply reducing it to a choice between going poor and feeling really morally uplifted by that, or disgracing yourself and becoming rich. I actually don't think that's how you think about it. The issue around human rights is a perennial one, and there is no doubt that China's activity towards its Uyghur population is appalling. The question, though, is what can a country like Australia actually do about that? Where do we have any influence? And it would appear to me that our influence doesn't come from a quick grab at the megaphone and then shouting out, "You're doing the wrong thing." It comes rather from being able to argue why respect for human rights, domestically and internationally, actually works to your advantage. In other words, you have a more stable and a more prosperous and a more secure society to the extent that you are able to accommodate the rights of all of your citizens. And if we think that that's just a problem for China dealing with its Uyghurs and perhaps dealing with Hong Kong, we should actually reflect a little bit on ourselves. We had the recognition of country when we began this webinar this morning. But the fact is, our own record in Australia in ensuring that the rights of Indigenous Australians are fully recognised and honoured and valued is not that good. And so we've got a bit of work to do ourselves, not in terms of a binary between rights and the economy, but rather a good, solid nation like Australia, able to move its way in the world, is going to be one which is inclusive, a country which respects each other, and a country which is confident of its ability to put the argument as to why you should have certain codes of behaviour, rather than simply calling out those who don't.
Jane, would you like to add anything to that?
Oh, I agree with everything Allan said, and he made, the key point I would make is if you are going to go around the world pointing out other people's human rights failings, then you really want to have your own house in order, and I don't think we do quite well enough to have that right, essentially. But the other big point is just to think through what a sanction could achieve, and as Allan said, and I know that the Australian government is working through diplomatic channels to talk about Xinjiang and Hong Kong. I mention Xinjiang every time I speak. I'm absolutely appalled by what I see there, and it brings me to tears on occasion to even think about it. The question is whether sanctions would achieve it. And I mean, just this week when I saw those Lowy poll numbers, I thought, if you put a sanction, okay, possibly on one Chinese official, well, then it just is not going to work. It won't change the behaviour. But put it on a company that operates in Xinjiang, and the people who are most likely to suffer from that are the, possibly in small numbers, but Uyghurs who are employed in those companies. So you think you're trying to solve a problem, but you might in fact make it worse for them, on top of the fact that you're upsetting the Beijing government, who will then punish you as well and probably not change their behaviour there. Very tricky stuff, though. Mm.
Yeah, obviously. So the next question that I have touches on the idea of Chinese influence in Australia, whether that's at universities, access to ports. We had some question around cyber warfare, and we had another question beforehand around China buying agricultural land. So these are kinds of perennial issues that get raised in a lot of the public sphere, but, you know, is there any merit to them? How concerned should we be? First to you, Jane.
Look, on interference, I think there definitely is cause for concern. It's been most visible in the university sector, where I've spent my working life. As an academic, nothing matters more really than academic freedom. We need to be able to speak freely, you know, based on evidence, based on learning, based on knowledge gathering about how we see the world. And as soon as either we're not allowed to do that or our Chinese colleagues are running into problems with doing that, then we've definitely got a problem. I mean, the bright side of that is that both the Australian government and the universities moved very quickly last year with the establishment of the Foreign Interference Task Force in the university sector. We came out before that, in fact, at the ANU with a very clear statement on academic freedom. It's something, if I stand up in a classroom, I'll mention every time that I want to have debates with people. I want to challenge their views. I want them to change my views, and we can only do that if we have the right to speak. And I've had some personal experiences, both directly at me and also with Chinese colleagues, that indicate that the Chinese government is trying to clamp down on that. And that is something that is deeply worrying for me. There are other kinds of interference that I think are overblown. You know, this notion that anyone who's been photographed with a Chinese party official in the last 10 years is somehow connected to the United Front and doing Beijing's bidding. I think I could raise the example of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology in Sydney, now headed by Professor James Lawrenson and formerly, of course, Bob Carr. Really unfair and untrue accusations that they were somehow funded. I mean, there was some Chinese funding that came in at a time when we were all receiving, universities, the funding's been flying in. They have continued to provide evidence-based and objective analysis, but are accused of being aligned, and not only just aligned, but paid by and somehow doing Beijing's bidding. And those narratives have genuinely been taken too far and need to be wound back. Should we maybe pass to Allan and then come back to the agricultural land question, because I've got more to say on that one.
Yeah, to you, Allan.
Look, maintaining a relationship with China is actually the business that we've all got to be able to get our minds around. The fact is, though, that leaving aside Zhou Enlai, who was really a brilliant diplomat, China hasn't yet built a tradition of international diplomacy. It's a work in progress. So it's hardly surprising that a number of its ploys are naive, that it's often ham-fisted, that it's sort of maladroit, that it sometimes tries to push people out of meetings or push other people in. It tried that game in Port Moresby during the APEC. It disrupted Julie Bishop's meeting on blood for diamonds up in the Kimberley a couple of years ago. These things happen all the time, and we do have cause for concern, and we do need to say to China, come on, you're better than that. But I'd have to say that we have also reason for concern more broadly. I mean, China's not the only country that seeks to influence Australian decision-making. We've got to have our eyes open in all directions. There are plenty of countries who would like us to take policy positions which strongly favour what they want, maybe even against what we think we want ourselves. So we've just got to be careful with everybody and maintain an even keel diplomacy with all of them. But I think it's really important that we get down onto the China's ownership of Australian land and all of that stuff, because there are a lot of misconceptions in there too, and I think Jane's right across it. So I'll flick it straight over to Jane.
Yeah, Jane, we were talking about this just before. Is there any cause for concern there?
This comes back to one of my opening points about what constitutes a China problem and what constitutes an opportunity, and how that narrative has changed, but also how different people see it very differently. And this idea that China owns too much of our agricultural land, first of all, to put the numbers right out there, in 2018, they owned approximately, and this is Chinese investors broadly, not the Chinese Communist Party, but a range of different investors, some of them state-owned, owned 2.4% of Australia's total agricultural land, which put them on an even keel with the United Kingdom, the top two foreign investors. So just 2.4%, I would say. Some might say that's too much. But of that 2.4% of China's land, actually 91% of it is leasehold. It's not owned by the Chinese in any way that you carve them up. So it's a very small percentage, but I think the more important point that I always come back to on Chinese investment is, if the Chinese weren't buying up that agricultural land and someone here in Australia wants to sell their land, then they're waiting and presumably want to sell it to the highest bidder. If you block the Chinese out of that, you sell it presumably to a lower price, because Australians are now and have always been net dissavers. We have a capital shortage that's existed since the country began, and we've always relied on foreign investment to come in and prop that capital up. Now, if you don't let it in, the very obvious consequence of that is, one, a lower sale price, so the individual farm seller is worse off, but also less capital wherever it comes from. And I'm not nationalistic about my capital. I'm not nationalistic about trade. It's a contentious issue, but I believe in buying the good that I want to buy, possibly at the best price. I take into consideration other things as well. But on land and on foreign investment more broadly, if you don't get it from China at this point, you don't get it at all, because there's no one else ready to invest. So if we're all prepared to start saving more and to pour that into our capital investments, rather than buying flat screen TVs, for example, or building bigger houses, then we could push China out of the market somehow. But that would come at a cost, and the cost comes back to jobs and growth, things that actually matter to the people out in the country, but they matter to me as well. I don't want unemployment. I don't want our economy to stagnate. And it's for that reason that I support Chinese investment, subject to the screening that our government takes and should take to ensure that it satisfies our security concerns.
Allan, did you want to add anything to that? Or?
No, I think I think Jane's dealt with that really well. There is a bit of sort of hyperinflation that goes into people's statements about how much foreign investment there is from China and Australia. It's very important to get it in perspective.
The next question I've got is about a more recent announcement, and feel free, if it's not quite your thing, Jane, we can move on to another topic, but about the Defence Strategic Update delivered today and the news that Australia is going to be spending a lot more on our defence capabilities. I might come to you first, Allan. What are the implications of this announcement, given the problems we've been having with our relationship with China? How do you think this will be interpreted?
We've always got to look at the relationship between appearance and reality, I think. The reality of what the Prime Minister is to announce today, from what I can make out, and I've only read media reports of his statement, is that the government is going to land on 2% of GDP as the size of the defence budget. And in order to do that, it's going to purchase some new sorts of missiles. It's going to recruit 800 more people for the Australian Defence Force. I think that probably is the winning edge, really, 800. It's going to sort of do a few other things, but the size of the announcement is actually not all that huge. It's really the intention that lies behind the announcement at this time that is more interesting, I think. Because coming as it does after the Prime Minister's announcements on cybersecurity and cyber interference and so on, it really does look as though we want to muscle up to China. To do as a professor at the ANU said maybe 10 years or so ago now, that we've got to be able to, quote unquote, rip an arm off China. This, I think, represents a kind of hubris, which would be very expensive if ever it were tested. It seems to me that no matter how much effort you put into bulking yourself up from being a featherweight to being a welterweight, you're still pretty crazy if you get into the ring with a heavyweight, because you'll just be smashed out of it. So while it is good to have an agile and flexible defence force able to deal with the sorts of things that we've traditionally dealt with, it is actually silly if we are wanting to have a defence force which is able to take on China's main force. That is absolutely something we can't do, and we shouldn't pretend that we could. And it's for that reason, again, that we must deeply invest in the diplomacy that will create a prosperous, a stable and a secure region in which China can grow, in which we can grow, and what's more important, our neighbours equally can grow, because it's out of that growth that we will actually have security.
Jane, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, just that I think it links back nicely to our opening discussion about this balance between security and prosperity, and the recognition that they're both functions of each other, and they both also then feed into the national interest. It does this, I think this latest sign is just another signal that the balance has really shifted in favour of the securitization of the relationship between Australia and China, but it also then is somewhat circular, coming out of the United States and their new narrative that China is the enemy and we need to do everything we can to prepare for the conflict that, you know, is in some sort of circular way rising up. It then makes sense for our government and for our media to talk about the problems with China. That then feeds into a public narrative that generates fear and reflects the fear that's being propagated throughout those various parts of the issue. And then lo and behold, what do we need? More defence spending so that we can tackle the problem, when perhaps we might have been able to sit down and nut out a more peaceful way. And I guess, you know, that leads me to one of the points I wanted to make in my opening about what the problem is with the China relationship at the moment. And it's that there is this hawks versus doves, or hawks versus panda huggers. I've always found panda huggers a bit of a strange label, because I don't know why anyone would want to hug a panda. Some people listening to me today might have tried to label me. I don't want those labels to exist, but given that they do and that those labels are probably flying my way as well, what this looks like is that the hawks, you know, are gathering strength. It gets played out in the defence spending numbers, and that points us in a direction that I'd rather not see Australia head, despite, of course, wanting a peaceful and secure nation and world.
Allan, I just wondered if I might come back to you on that. And we have talked in the past about the securitization of various issues, but is spending a whole chunk of money on defence really going to make Australia more secure?
No. The short answer is no. I mean, Hugh White, in his most recent book, has been arguing that we should be spending, say, 4% of GDP on our national defence, with a big emphasis on submarines, closing down the army completely, and taking and not having any more surface ships. That's one way of thinking about it. But I want to come back to my rather pathetic boxing analogy. Okay, so we can ambition to bulk up from being a featherweight to being a middleweight. But even if you do that, you still can't take on a country which is a superpower, which has got overweening military force behind it if it seeks to use it. The important thing there is not to be in the ring. It is to use your intellectual capacities, your diplomatic capacities, use all of the tools that you've got to have a sound knowledge base, to be able to look forward to the things that you need to do together, rather than shape up on the things that divide you. And for my money, at this point, the hawks are far, far too focused on the things that divide us, and not nearly focused enough on the things that we need to come together if we're going to deal with them effectively. And as I mentioned earlier, they're things like the pandemic, like climate change, like nuclear weapons, like prosperity for all, like the ability of people to live a decent life in whatever country they live. These are the things that actually get human beings together. And I suppose I might just finish that, Ebony, by saying, I've never been worried before about having a photograph of myself taken with a senior Chinese leader. But I suppose that since I do have a photograph of myself taken with Zhao Ziyang when he visited Australia way back in 1983, I'd better destroy it and make sure that it doesn't come out, because it would be terrible to think that my relationship with Zhao Ziyang would see me simply as a kind of fall guy for China.
I might just wrap up with hopefully a more brief question to Jane. Thank you, Allan. There's a lot of people asking questions about the China's Belt and Road Initiative, and it strikes me as something that we hear about constantly in the media, but never really gets explained what it is or kind of what the aims are. So just in a couple of minutes, Jane, are you able to explain for a lay person what the Belt and Road Initiative is and what it involves?
I am, Ebony, and I'm looking up there. I did notice someone in the chat room saying, look at all the books up on Jane's shelf, and it is fairly shameless self-promotion. I am a proud member of the ANU community, and they are the yearbooks back there. In the one, Prosperity, I wrote about the Belt and Road Initiative, and I was contrasting it with Donald Trump's, or the trade war coming out of the United States. I mean, they really happened at the same time, and it was America's, America First policy, whilst China was there, and actually was why I chose the theme of prosperity for that year, because Xi Jinping and the party apparatus was going around the world talking about how they would bring win-win development opportunities for everyone. Now, the question of, do I see this as entirely altruistic? Absolutely not. The main motivations for the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, were internal, domestic objectives. So, a lot of excess steel capacity, slumping or slowing growth in lots of parts of the country, a regional development imperative to try and speed up the process of industrialization in the Western regions, which links into the first thing that got me interested in China. And so they did present it as an economic plan. And again, as an economist with the training that I'd had, I could see why, or at least I thought, not such a bad plan, as I mentioned at the beginning. Put roads in, it's not necessarily the case that markets will then emerge and solve the problems, but the win-win strategy made sense to me as an economist. That doesn't mean that there aren't strategic motivations as well. And in fact, they made that very clear from the beginning. A well-known strategic analyst in China, Wang Jisi, from the beginning said, and it was a response to the United States blocking China or preventing China from joining the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And Wang Jisi said, well, if they're going to block us out of that, we need to look westwards. If you think of the China map, looking out to the west to Xinjiang and across the Eurasian zone, and that will help us reduce our reliance on the West, America, and develop new markets. So that was also, again, that's clearly strategic. On top of that is the case that, yes, when you engage economically with other countries, and I've really come to learn about this only in recent years because I was an economist formerly. I'm now more of a geo-economist. I think much more about the strategic and the political implications of using economic tools. That's what geo-economics is, and it's the world that we now live in. And so in that book, in Prosperity, I described it as a geo-economic strategy, and one that made more sense to me than an America First strategy. Not to say that it's perfect, but in economic terms, absolutely opening up to the rest of the world seems like a better idea than shutting them out.
Thanks, Jane. And just to wrap us up in 30 seconds, Allan, how would you improve Australia's relationship with China?
Look, I must say, Jane has absolutely nailed the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative thing. Fantastic. Look, I would just start being quiet. I would get off the megaphone. I'd calm down. I'd not link defence things to China. I'd link them to much broader issues of national security over time. And most particularly, I'd resurrect a professional diplomacy conducted by diplomats in Beijing and in Canberra as a way of getting back to a much more stable political relationship.
Well, we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for an excellent discussion, Professor Jane Golley and Allan Behm today. And thank you everyone for your wonderful questions and for keeping it reasonably civil in the chat. We really appreciate all the interactions, and I'm sorry that we can't get to every single question, but hopefully we've covered a number of topics there today. You can join us next week. We don't have a speaker confirmed yet, but there'll be details up soon for next week's webinar, and you can find all of our previous webinar recordings as well as details for upcoming events at tai.org.au/webinars. I don't have details for next week yet, but on the 15th of July, we're hoping to do one in consultation with Antar about treaty and sovereignty. So we'll send you details for that soon. And please make sure that you're subscribed to our podcast, Follow the Money. You can find that on iTunes or wherever you listen to all good podcasts. And this audio will be up on there very shortly. And please stay 1.5 meters away, keep washing your hands, and stay safe, everyone. Thanks, and we'll hope to see you next week.